Thanks everyone for tuning in this evening. This is a live presentation brought to you by the Friends of the Ulysses S. Grant Cottage, now a National Historic Landmark. And we are very, very pleased to be able to have some wonderful panelists. I have searched high and low, near and far, to come up with some wonderful folks. Some of them you've heard of, some of them you haven't. But I think what's wonderful about it is that they bring some wonderful experience and passion. And that's what we really are looking for in our discussion this evening. This evening's discussion will be about a factor of Grant's life, a facet, I should say, of Grant's life that is often overlooked, but it really played a large role in the decisions that he made throughout his life, in his entire state of mind. And it was, his family was a support structure for him. And we're really going to see how important family was for Ulysses S. Grant, and how important he was to his family as well. It was really a reciprocal relationship. All right, so we'll get right into the panelist introductions. I'll get mine out of the way because I'm not really a panelist. I'm the moderator, so I promise I will shut up at a certain point. My name is Ben Kemp. I'm the operations manager at Grant Cottage State Historic Site in upstate New York. I am an avid Grant researcher and living historian, and I've been featured on television, if that means anything. I'm more excited to introduce the panelists this evening. Our first panelist is Dr. Marie Kelsey, and she's a graduate of the University of Wisconsin with a PhD in library science. She is retired from and professor emerita at the College of St. Scholastica in Duluth, Minnesota. She has nurtured an interest in Ulysses S. Grant for 25 years and is a member of the Ulysses S. Grant Association. She is the author of Ulysses S. Grant, a bibliography, and maintains the Ulysses S. Grant Information Center website and Facebook page, which I recommend to everyone to access for some amazing links and information on pretty much everything to do with Grant. So we're so excited to have you with us. Second panelist is Ulysses Grant Dietz. Served as curator of decorative arts at the Newark Museum from 1980 until 2017, and was appointed chief curator in 2012. He received his bachelor's in French from Yale University in 1977 and his master's in American material culture from the University of Delaware's Winterthur program in 1980. Mr. Dietz has published numerous articles on the decorative arts drawn from the Newark Museum's nationally known collections. His most recent publications are Masterpieces of Art Pottery, 1880 to 1930, from the New York Museum, and Dream House, the White House as an American Home. Mr. Dietz is a great, is it three greats?
Just two.
Two greats. Great-great-grandson of Ulysses and Julia Grant and an active promoter of their legacy. So we're very excited to have you with us, Ulysses. Thank you so much. And last but certainly not least, we have Ranger Nick Sacco. Nick is a park ranger with the National Park Service at Ulysses S. Grant National Historic Site in St. Louis, Missouri. He regularly gives tours of Grant's St. Louis home, Whitehaven, and has written several published journal articles on 19th century U.S. history. He has also worked at Gateway Arch National Park, Reconstruction Era National Park, Historical Park, and St. Genevieve National Historical Park. In 2019, Nick wrote an article about Grant's views on slavery that was published with the Journal of the Civil War Era. And in 2020, he won an Outstanding Service Award from the National Park Service. Nick holds a master's degree in history from Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis. So Wonderful. Great credentials across the board. But now this is where the rubber meets the road. This is where we get into the discussions. And again, thank you all. We're so grateful to have you participate this evening, and I'm sure our audience is as well. So if everyone's ready, we're going to get right into it. So the first question that we have preset is, and this is, I find this a very interesting thing because I believe at one point, I can't think of the reference now, but Ulysses S. Grant later in his life supposedly said to someone, if you figure out what kind of a, if you want to know what kind of a man someone is, find out what kind of a boy they were. So we're going to talk about Grant's childhood first. And the question is, how may Grant's childhood experiences have shaped his relationship to family? And anybody want to take that first? Anybody? Want to jump in on the childhood? Nick? Okay, Nick, go ahead.
Yeah, so when you read Ulysses S. Grant's personal memoirs, chapter 1, there's a couple things that immediately kind of stick out to you, or at least stuck out to me. One is that, Grant doesn't go too in depth in terms of specific details about the relationship he had with his parents or his brothers and sisters. It is a rather brief discussion of his parents and of his family life. But two things that really stick out. One, Grant really emphasizes the fact that his father really valued an education. He talks about how Jesse Grant, his father, was a constant reader. He also mentions that that Jesse Grant, he read every book he can borrow in the neighborhood where he lived. So Grant really stresses that he grew up in a household where reading, where education was really valued. And another thing that really sticks out is that Grant really stresses the hard work, the labor that he did as a boy. He talks about making deliveries for his father on horseback. He talks about working on the farm and working for his father's tannery. So I think for Grant, when he becomes a father himself, I think you can really see in his letters that he imparts both of those things onto his 4 children. The importance of education during the Civil War. There's a handful of letters where Ulysses is writing to Julia and offering suggestions on what the children should be studying in school and where they should be studying. And then we get little anecdotes like Fred Grant, the oldest son. He mentions that when the Grants lived in St. Louis, he would get on the horse cart with his father and go downtown to St. Louis to sell firewood and farm goods. So I think we can see here that Grant, he aspires to provide a good quality life for his family that really emphasizes the importance of a good education and hard work as well. So there's a couple things that stick out to me in answering that question.
Thanks so much. Great answer. And who would like to jump in there on Grant's childhood? How did it shape the man? Anybody?
I wanted to go first just because I knew Nick was going to be such a ringer and have such good information. But I've read a couple of things recently that really struck me. But my initial reaction to this question was more about how his childhood affected the way he was as a father. And although all of that works in there, because it's one of the things I've sort of had to force myself to deal with over the years. And what everyone in the audience needs to understand is that nobody in the Grant family actually grew up learning this stuff at their grandfather's knee or anything like that. This was something that, and nobody in the family I've ever talked to sat around and talked about U.S. Grant as children. It just didn't happen. It was something that was acknowledged, but it was all in the background. So we've had to learn it, and it's been a real journey of mine. But his relationship to his own children and his wife, but his relationship to his family in general is very much a sort of a counterpoint to, I think, the way he felt about his own family. And I think I've given Jesse Grant short shrift, Father Jesse wrote Grant, because I do think Jesse really loved his oldest son, but he loved him in one of those difficult American ways that was like needling and prodding and pushing and, you know, driving him crazy. As I've noticed in my own lifetime, fathers do that. I mean, I probably do too, now that I think of it. But, and then his mother, who he adored, but we know so little about because she said so little. I mean, she was such a retiring person that his relationship with her was so private, and such the opposite of Julia's, which was so much his relationship to Julia, which was on his sleeve and emotional and just sort of right up front, because she was not one to hide her feelings, except her criticism of her husband, which one hardly knows about because she hid it so well. And so, and I think he related to his children the way he wished he had related to his parents. And I think this was not about love, it was about ease and warmth and sort of hands-on qualities. And I sort of have a big sense that this alternated across the generations, because I know I quizzed my mother about her relationship to her father, who was Ulysses S. Grant III, and she was the youngest of 3 daughters born to therefore ending the chance of the name carrying on in her family. And yet he was an extraordinarily devoted father to those 3 girls. So whereas his father and mother were loving, but more formal than Fred's father, my great-grandfather was Fred, so his relationship to his 2 children was way more formal than his father's relationship was to him. And I think this is actually just a natural generational back and forth that happens maybe in every culture, but certainly in American culture. But I think absolutely his hard work as a kid, and I think I want Marie to talk about this. There's a book that she and I have read, but is not published yet, about his education, and it's so interesting. But his childhood was so much harder. I don't mean difficult, but harder in terms of work and responsibility and duty than any of his children's childhood was, and that can't be an accident.
Wonderful, wonderful. You kind of queued up Marie. You kind of put her on the spot.
I didn't mean to stick her with that answer, but yeah, I'll say it if you don't want to.
I can't say who's writing that book or if it's ever going to be published, but it does look at the intellectual development of Grant. So often people say that he didn't have much of any intellect and they wanted to know really what was going on in that head, and it seemed quite often like there wasn't much going on. But that's really far from the case because, as you pointed out, his father made sure he got a good education. And even though he had kind of a relaxed attitude toward it, obviously he absorbed something. And hopefully this book will be published and you'll all get to see what this is all about. It's a very interesting take on what he read and how the things that he read about and internalized, how they came out later in his life. So it'll be pretty good if it ever gets published. I hope it does. But what I wanted to say about Jesse, and I agree with Ulysses, that he gets a short shrift, probably from the population at large. I've heard people describe him as not being the nicest person, and kind of must have been tough to have him as a father. But basically, I think he was a great father. I mean, he took very good care of that family. He cared about them very deeply. Maybe he didn't show it in the same way that Fred Dent did down there in the South, but he was all right in the heart where it mattered. And what struck me is that both he and Hannah were very lenient with Ulysses as long as he did his chores, did what was expected of him work-wise, and then he'd go and do what he wanted. And he had a lot of freedom. They trusted him. Hannah let him play underneath horses when he was a child. How much freer do you get than that, right? And Jesse would let him roam the countryside, making deliveries and acting as a taxi driver around the area. So when I started reading it to do this presentation, I hadn't realized how much Grant let his own children do pretty much be the same way, especially with Fred. He really gave Fred a lot of leeway, and a lot of independence. So, and the others as well, but especially Fred and Buck, two older boys. So I think that he was treated that way at home, and that he handed that on.
That's a great take. That's a really great take.
I love that.
Those are some of the things that I hadn't, really considered about his childhood. That he, it seemed like, as you guys were mentioning, that it seemed like there was some, as Ulysses said, a generational shift in that Grant was so much more open with his affection. We'll talk about that probably a little bit more as we go along. Than his parents. Didn't mean they loved him any less, but the idea is that the actual showing of the affection in public or even private displays certainly changed and shifted between the two generations. But the idea of independence and just expecting, respect, and we're going to get into that a little bit more when we talk about how Grant managed his children. So we'll get into, and this is something that I'm sure, probably everybody will have. We've already alluded to it slightly, but one of the interesting things is that you talk about family, you have to factor in, the wider family. And one of the things that comes into that is the Dent family, which is Grant's in-laws at the farm in St. Louis. And Grant is going to spend considerable amount of time there prior to the Civil War. And so he's going to be influenced to some degree by the time he's spending there. So the question is, what were the differences in the family dynamics between the Grants and the Dents? That's Julia's family, of course. What were the relationships like between those two families? And Grant is later accused of being, by a Grant family member, that he was infected basically with the Dent ways. They had certain Southern, ways, or there, whatever it may be, sectional, or just they were talking specifically about that family. I don't know, but the Dent ways, which was, open affection was one of those things. Let's say letting the children run amok, but there was some accusations of that. And so, what effect do you think, living with the Dents and interacting with the Dent family had on Grant as, in respect to how he dealt with his family? So we're kind of asking a similar question that we just did, just in the effect of, how did his family and his, in childhood. Now we're saying a little bit, how did the Dent family play a role in possibly influencing his later relation to his own family? So who wants to take? Oh,
I have an image in my mind from Julia's memoirs where she talks about her father, who she always refers to as, I'm going to give it the French pronunciation. I think she called him Papa and not Papa, although I don't know which. But where she runs out onto the piazza at Whitehaven, and he lifts her up and has her look at the trees and the clouds, and so there's this. And I used it as kind of a joke kickoff to this lecture, but it was the idea that she was just totally caught up in this affection with her father. And I will say a lot of Grant buffs want to give Fred Dent short shrift because he was the evil slave owner. And I just read Jesse's memoirs for the first time, which I've had for years. And he talks at length and very fondly about his Dent grandfather and what a lovely, gentle person he was and how much fun it was to spend time with him. And I'm thinking maybe I really need to rethink this. I was questioning the question's use of the term Dent ways, because I hadn't thought about that, the sort of kind of highly emotional, and my father's family, the Dietzes, are loud and emotional and huggers and kissers, whereas the other side of my family was not. So I can sort of see that, the idea that the Dents were emotional and talked loud and argued with each other, except I think of Jesse Grant as doing that. So, but that's more in a men's context. I don't see Hannah ever having a spirited discussion with her husband. and quiet conversations with her son. So, but I was also thinking about the kind of the Dent ways struck me as that he was much discussed in his own family because he worked with Fred Dent's slaves in the fields at Whitehaven, if I'm understanding what I've read, and that he was criticized in St. Louis for not being very good at it because, you know, he didn't hit them and yell at them and do the things you're supposed to do, apparently. So that's what I thought you meant by Dent ways. But I think it probably comes back to the idea of being emotional and sentimental in ways that the Grants probably didn't let themselves be.
Yeah, so to jump in and add to that wonderful comment there, here's something to consider. Grant graduates from West Point in 1843, and he is sent to Jefferson Barracks in the fall of 1843, and shortly thereafter makes his first appearance at Whitehaven. But Julia Dent does not come back to Whitehaven until February of 1844. So we have to remember that Grant was a regular visitor to Whitehaven for several months before he even knew who Julia Dent was. So if you really think about it, if this would have been a one and done where Grant went to Whitehaven one time, met the Dents, had a dinner, and never came back, we wouldn't be here in this Zoom meeting today. Grant felt very comfortable at Whitehaven. He was enamored with the lifestyle, I would argue. While acknowledging that I have my problems with William McFeely's Pulitzer Prize book on Grant, 1981, he makes the argument that Grant, in some ways, when he farms in the 1850s at Whitehaven, in some ways he tries to emulate his father-in-law's lifestyle. And I do think there is some merit to that. I think he was very close with Ellen Dent, his mother-in-law. His mother-in-law was a big supporter of him during the most difficult of times. I think Grant felt like these were people who he could trust to share his feelings with. I think Julia's siblings, all of Grant's sister and brothers-in-laws, were all very close with Grant. So I definitely think the Dent ways or the Dent family dynamic most certainly left an impression on Grant. So that's kind of what I would throw into the discussion here.
Wonderful.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on that a little bit, Nick. I agree with you completely, and I think mainly what he got from the family is this sense of hospitality and warmth and friendliness that he didn't seem to get from home. And so I asked myself, well, did this lead to a conscious effort on his part to be warmer and more emotionally giving with his own children? Or is this something that you know, he just felt that way. When the time came, that's just the way he felt. And he felt warm and loving towards his whole family in a way that he didn't get in his own home. And I don't know if he learned something from the Dents or if it was already within him and it came out when he had a family. And the other thing is that I have to say that both Julia and Ulysses had father issues, right? They both, they really did. And they both had kind and loving and long-suffering mothers, but they did have problems with their fathers. Both of them were opinionated, and both of them tried to control their individual children to some extent. You know, Jesse Grant wrote to Jefferson Davis when Davis was a Secretary of War and said, no, my son doesn't want to get out of the Army. Just forget about that letter that came to you, you know, just give him some leave and let him go home for a while.
And how old was he at that point?
Oh, 30, you know, so
Yeah.
no, what was he by then? Yeah, he was,
Yeah.
He was maybe around 30, 31. Yeah, so Davis says, he didn't tell us any of that. He didn't tell us that he wanted to go home or anything. He just said he wants out, that's it, he can go. So in that way, Jesse tried to control Grant. I also think that Fred Dent tried to control Julia by trying to keep her home after. In fact, he he didn't want Julia to marry Ulysses, but when he finally said, okay, it's going to be all right, they got married and they came back from their honeymoon. And old man Dent, Fred Dent, said, well, Julia, why don't you stay here and let Ulysses go to his post? And Grant goes, what do you think, Julia? And she says, oh, no, I'm coming with you. So that's the way it worked out. But he did try to manipulate her into staying at home with him because she was his favorite child, essentially. So
I think that's a very good, all of those points are excellent in how did Grant's interaction with the Dents possibly influence him. As you mentioned, it's impossible to know for sure whether, I'm sure he had all these things within him to begin with, but maybe being around that environment where it was more acceptable just drew them out of him. And I think I agree with that. You never know for sure, but it certainly could have played an influence as well. And as you talk about bringing the father issue, obviously Grant did have to draw a line in the sand. I think he always felt like there should be a respect that was, really bred into people back then, that you have to have instilled. You have to have a respect for your elders, especially your father or your father-in-law for that matter. Obviously he had to play it, he had to play it nice with his father-in-law if he wanted the hand of his love, Julia. For his own father, he put up with quite a bit, and then obviously he drew the line in the sand over things like the debacle with the, in the Civil War with the cotton traders. There were certain situations where his father overstepped anything that he wasn't willing to do something for his father that was inappropriate. He had to draw the line somewhere, and he seemed to want to be independent from. Maybe, Nick may agree, wanted to be independent enough to build a small log cabin on the property of his father, seemingly just to try to, get some independence, get some space between him and his father-in-law. So we'll go right into the next segment, which is really looking at, and we haven't had any debate yet. I don't know if we're going to have anybody. It can happen on a panel. You can have differences of opinion, but I think we all have some like here. So we're going to go into the relationship of Grant and Julia a little bit, because that's going to set the stage for us talking about them and how they interacted with their family. So what type of a husband was Grant? And obviously you can mention what he was like in the 4 years leading up to the marriage. And there's a claim out there, and I think it is backed up by a little bit of quite a bit of evidence, that Grant was to some extent wrapped around Julia's finger. And, do you think that's a fair assessment? And third part of the question is, was there a key to their marriage? It could be multiple things, but was there any keys to the marriage to create this marriage that it withstood 2 wars and 2 terms in politics, separations and the like that were necessary, and obviously Grant being heavily involved in work. So questions are: what kind of a husband was Grant? Was he really wrapped around Julia's finger? And what was their key to the long marriage? And whoever wants to jump in first.
Yeah, so I guess I do have to admit I'm not exactly sure what it means to be wrapped around somebody's finger. I know the Police song, but I would say that really I think every person deserves the sort of relationship that Ulysses and Julia had. I think the love between the two of them was very strong. And anybody that has the kind of relationship that they did is in a really positive and wonderful relationship. I just think there's really a couple keys that are essential to their success as a couple. One is just an open line of communication. Ulysses certainly at times is not happy because Julia is not writing enough letters to him. But if you go through the Grant papers, it's very clear that they're sharing a lot of information when they're separated. They're keeping open that line of communication. Almost every letter when the Grants started having kids, Ulysses is asking about what's going on with the kids' lives, what are they doing? So I think the two of them, they work together well as partners. And more explicitly, I think, in some ways they probably viewed each other as best friends. One of my favorite stories is that when William Belknap, the Secretary of War under Grant, who was doing all sorts of crooked stuff as Secretary of War, he runs to Grant and offers his letter of resignation when the news comes out that he's going to get in trouble. And Julia goes to Ulysses and says, "Hey, what's going on?" And the president said, "Let me work through this, and I'll go back and I'll tell you all about it." And so, he can talk to Julia, and they can talk about politics. They can talk about war. They were equals in these conversations. And so, an effective communication, a partnership, and the view that you're best friends, it's a recipe for success.
Yeah, I think the characterization of wrapped around her finger, that whole, aside from the Sting song, which now I've got totally in my head, the implication there is that he is her superior and is being weak by letting her control him. Mm-hmm. But what you said, I think, is so important, is that he and maybe this is the Dent ways he learned before he met her, but he is totally in love with her, but he's not blind to her foibles. And foibles is a great word because I don't know quite what it means, and it's not quite critical. He knows her weaknesses. He knows how to indulge her, but he also knows her intelligence. And he understands the way most people don't, outside of her family, how bright she is. Because it's something I hadn't thought about. This is not a typical Victorian, well, it may be typical, but it's not the archetype of the dominant husband and the devoted wife. She is a devoted wife, but she is, from the very time they meet, as far as I can tell, his intellectual equal and his sort of emotional half, that she knows how to work him and he knows how to work her, and how to they care for each other. And there's a lot to be said about that, but I think she does have him wrapped around her little finger, but he has her wrapped around his little finger too. And so now I've got this sort of pinky swear thing in mind, is that they're totally wrapped up in each other, and they have the kind of, I've forgotten, Marie, whoever it is who wrote this, a book about the wives of the Civil War generals, and it has this long, complicated title.
Yes, Candace Shy Hooper.
That is Candace Hooper. Yeah. And basically, Julia is the one who comes across best of any Civil War general's wife, because their partnership is so much based on mutual love and respect. And I think, and it's the same way he deals with his children, that what looks like indulgence to outsiders is simply respecting them as people who are wise enough to make their own decisions, and being corrective if he needs to be. Now, I do have a question for both of you, if you don't, or all three of you, is that I read a story somewhere that when they were in the White House, they were very social. Again, now that you say this, I think his ability to enjoy social situations as president comes from the Dents. That they teach him a sort of cosmopolitan ease, because he doesn't like crowds. But there is this story that Julia would come burbling up to them, and he would be in the middle of a conversation, and she would burst into the conversation and start talking without listening. And then he would drop a bomb and walk away, leaving her stuck in an awkward conversation. Did I just make that up, or is that because that's happened to me on occasion in my life, and I'm just thinking that this may be a family trait, but that he did that purposely to sort of tease her, and to sort of, that was his way of correcting her when she wasn't quite focusing in the situation of what he was doing. And I can't have made that up. So anybody, Marie, have you ever heard of that?
No, I'm sorry.
What did I read?
It sounds similar to the way that his children remember him. The idea of dropping a bomb. He would say something so simple, but it cut to the heart. It was something. I'm disappointed in you. Or I can't believe you said that, Julia. and then just walk away. And it was like straight to the heart, because that's all you get. And he's gone, you know? And I think there's definitely a couple of instances that I've read about that from his children, and, you know, from Fred, especially his oldest son. And I do remember an instance of him saying that he was, you know, couldn't believe that Julia had said something that she said. And I imagine that probably caught her to the heart, because again, he just kind of commanded a respect, not through tyranny, it doesn't seem like, but from, you know, through punishment or anything like that, or control, but through just his own example, you know, and he nurtured the respect instead of demanding it seemed like. So it does sound like the one instance of the wrapped around the finger that I know was a story. I don't know if it's true. It was an anecdote where he was coming down and wasn't dressed properly for church, and Julia, you know, dragged him back upstairs to put something better on him. You know, the idea that, you know, and there was a few instances where people remarked that, you know, he would do, you know, whatever she wanted. You know, he was always at her beck and call. You know, and again, some of these come from, you know, maybe some jaded Grant family members that may not have a purely objective view of Grant's life. So.
Yeah, I think that anything relating to his physical appearance and anything else in his life that he just didn't care about, if she wanted to change him and fix him up or do anything, yeah, that was okay with him. He'd sit there, whatever. But when it came like to the war, she would try to influence things with the different soldiers and the officers, and that didn't go over. He put a stop to that. And I traced several different examples through the letters. It was in some of the books about the family. And in different cases, he'd say yes, and then he'd say no. And somebody would come and appeal to her to get her husband to let so-and-so off because he's going to be executed tomorrow morning or something. And so she'd go and beg Ulysses, and if he felt it was in the best interest of the country, he would just say, no, it has to be this, thus, and so. But one time she sat and pouted for a couple of hours, and then he changed his mind on this important
I do
matter.
remember that anecdote. That's a really good, you know, point. You know, that she did have, you know, some. I love how you put it. She did have some power over him. He had power over her. It was a power exchange that seemed to work. And I think one of the things I also find interesting about their dynamic, real quickly before we move on, is that they seem to be able to really have a playful relationship as well, without, you know, it getting too edgy. And I think that, you know, that's something that's, I think, essential to a healthy relationship, is to be able to joke around. And they, you know, there's multiple incidences of them kind of teasing each other pretty, you know, fairly lightly. You know, I think one or two of them are mentioned in the book that Ulysses mentioned earlier, in the days of my father, General Grant, by Jesse R. Grant. And it's out of print now. It was printed, I think, in 1930 or something. But you can get copies off the internet. But it's the exchange of being able to tease each other. And there's a few anecdotes that really speak to that throughout their life. So, you know, Grant did have a sense of humor. He did have a sense of humor, and Julia did too. So we'll move on to, now this is interesting. How did Julia and Ulysses share the responsibilities of managing their household? I'm sure it changed. I mean, obviously it changed a little bit when the kids were younger, up and through, but you know, how did they share those responsibilities of parenthood?
Of parenthood, or just other things in general?
Well, I mean, yeah, you can say the management of the household in general, yeah.
I was thinking of household tasks, and I think when they were first married, I don't think they necessarily shared any tasks. There is an article it's from a journal called The Homemaker, and Julia wrote it, and you probably are familiar with this. She could decorate, she could take care of all of that, but she couldn't cook. She could make things, you know, be surrounding them, be very pretty and soothing and attractive. But she found out that she didn't know how to cook. And Grant was really surprised at that, because he thought everybody could cook, because he had experience with cooking, especially at West Point, but I think then as quartermaster as well. So he got her some live-in help, or not live-in, but some servants, and they did the cooking for Julia and for the family. And he did give her an allowance, so that was his part, I guess, to contribute to the household management. He gave her an allowance to take care of things around the house, and she tried to keep accounts of it and, you know, tell what she'd bought and what she'd spent the money on and how much she'd spent. And sometimes she'd come up short, and then he'd just kind of laugh and give her some more money. And one time she asked him, would you please look at these accounts? I can't figure out what's happening here. And so he took a look at it, and what did he say? Excuse me, I cannot make out your mathematical conundrums. And if there was a deficit, he just handed some money over to her. So in the early days, I think she took care of the house and he took care of his job. But boy, when he went to the war, she had to pick up an awful lot and take care of, besides managing 4 children and relations with her father and with her in-laws and managing property and managing money. She did an awful lot, and she did it as well as she possibly could, given the circumstances. So that's kind of my take on it. Yeah. She kind of grew in her role as somebody with responsibility.
And I think she definitely grew in her role, and especially when he was away. I think about those years when he was in the West, and that she was coping. I mean, she had family around her always, but she was coping. But, you know, again, this does fall into where my career covered, is that the expectations of gender roles were pretty cast in stone, and it wasn't that they were consciously, you know, men's stuff, women's stuff. It was, that's just the way it was. So I'm curious to find out more about, once there were children, it just dawned on me. I wonder, did he ever change a child's diaper? Do we have any evidence of that? Because I know my father did in the 40s and 50s. So, but I'm curious about that, because I'm sure he was more engaged with the children at a personal level than a lot of fathers were, than his own father was, beyond work, you know, chores and that sort of thing. But I wouldn't have expected all that much more, because it was Julia's job to be a homemaker. I mean, that word is a very powerful, loaded word. And her mother had been a great homemaker. And I'm sort of interested that possibly she was a little more spoiled than the other children as her father's pet, and didn't quite get the training she should have. I mean, she certainly, I know she learned to cook some more, but I also have the question that I wanted to raise, because, and I know, Nick, you'll have an answer to this, is that when did Fred Dent assign some of his slaves to Julia? Because the line I give is that because he didn't expect Ulysses to be able to pay for people to take care of his little girl, and therefore he assigned some of the household servants, the enslaved people who Julia had known all of her life, to be with her. And then there was the woman named Jules, who stayed with them for a long time, and who Jesse remembers in his memoirs being raised by her. I mean, that she was his nursemaid as a child. So speak to that a little bit, because that would have made things very different, even at a place like Hardscrabble.
Sure. So, well, first of all, I do think this is a really important point that you're both making, in terms of highlighting the fact that there are servants and or enslaved people that do some of the tasks for the Grant family, and that extends beyond their time in St. Louis. I believe in the 1860 census, there is a servant who is listed on the census with the Grant family in the 1860 entry, and of course, the Civil War and Grant's presidency. So there's always somebody besides just Ulysses and Julia that is doing some of those, managing of the household, so to speak. Now, Colonel Dent, yes, he had a habit of sort of informally gifting or perhaps loaning property and enslaved people to his children. So in 1848, when Ulysses and Julia marry, he informally gifts 80 acres of Whitehaven land to the Grants. So this is the land that Grant is working on in the 1850s as a farmer. So technically he did not legally own that property, but he, was sort of gifted from his father-in-law. And it's the same thing with the four enslaved people, Dan, Eliza, John, and Julie. We don't have an exact date. Julia Grant in her memoirs does not give an exact date, but one would have to think that it was either, the 1848 marriage or at some point, perhaps in the 1850s. But then again, Julia talks about growing up with enslaved people. So it's kind of hard to give an exact date on when those four people were sort of informally gifted to Julia. Again, she didn't technically own them in a legal sense, but most certainly benefited from them. And Jewel, who Ulysses mentioned, she is with Julia Grant for about half of the war, late 1861 until January of 64. She is right alongside Julia Grant, helping to raise the children and attending to anything that Julia Grant needed until she decided to vote for freedom herself and ran away in January of 64. So to get back to the question that Ben had very quickly, I'll just go back to the education. There's a great letter that General Grant writes to Julia where he basically says, I don't want the kids studying music. I want them to study a foreign language. I don't want them to study music or dancing. So he's kind of giving specific instructions on the curriculum that his children would be receiving during the Civil War. And so, here we've got, General Grant focused on the battlefield, but he's still thinking about what his kids are doing in school. And of course, Julia is going to be on the ground, making sure that the kids are doing their work in school. So it's a great example of sharing the responsibilities of the household, even though Grant is on the battlefield.
For some reason, Grant was bound and determined they were going to learn German.
He was adamant about that. Yeah, he wanted them to learn German. So it's interesting.
Well, wasn't there a lot of Germans in German population in St. Louis?
Yes, yeah, there was a large German population, large Irish population as well. But if you would have walked the streets of St. Louis in the 1850s, you would have heard German everywhere you went. So that was a commonly spoken language here in St. Louis.
All right, that's wonderful. Those are great responses. It seems as though they shared the responsibilities. Sometimes Grant would, kind of set some boundaries even when he was away at war, and Julia was the one who actually had to manage them on the ground. That's a great way to look at it. Picking up a lot of slack, as Marie said, she picked up a lot of slack during the war and when he was away. And to speak to Ulysses' question, the only thing I've come across, I haven't come across diapers. I don't think they talked about that much, but they're washable back then.
Unspoken.
Yeah. What I did find was a reference. I think it was Fred said that his father always took an incredibly keen interest when the children were sick. So he was right bedside, anything they needed, medicine, broth. I mean, he was right on top of it, right at the bedside, literally just sitting there, just being a bedside, being a nurse almost. So that he was pretty clear about that. And for him to remember that, and Fred had some serious illnesses as a little child, and some deathly illnesses that were close to death at times. And so he said his father was incredibly, it certainly wasn't below him to do that if necessary. I think if there was other people around, I think anybody would opt out of it. But I think he was willing, and that's the point. It wasn't below him. So let's get into the management of the children. Why don't we? There's a little, I'm going to read a little excerpt from the personal memoirs of Julia Dent Grant. Couldn't have her husband outdo her. She had to write hers as well. So there was, again, a sharing, but they both wrote their memoirs. So there's another equality there. And it says, Jessie, was sometimes late for breakfast. This is during the White House years. This was something the general was particular about. He said, Jess, how is this? 9 o'clock and you just down for breakfast? When I was your age, I had to get up, feed 4 or 5 horses, cut wood for the family, take breakfast, and be off to school by 8 o'clock. Jess was not the least bit disconcerted. He looked up smilingly and said, oh yes, but you do not have such a papa as I have, you see. I smiled and left the room saying, you're a saucy little rascal, Jess. So that leads into a question, or an accusation, I should say, again, from a member, I believe, of the Grant family, who said that they were too lenient with their children, that they were too lenient, and it's already been mentioned that very, very indulgent as well, or I should say, can seem overly indulgent, potentially. Do you think that there's evidence for this, that they were too lenient with the children, that they had behavioral problems because of this? Again, he was also described as a very indulgent, maybe even described as overindulgent. And do you think there's a reason for that? So the questions are basically, were they too lenient with their children in general? And why do you think he may have been overindulgent if he was?
So I guess I'll kind of kick off with some thoughts here. I think first and foremost, we need to look at the 4 children and how their lives turned out. And, on the balance, on the whole, I'd say that all 4 of them went on to live happy, successful lives, mostly happy. There's definitely struggles for the 4 children. I can't imagine how difficult it would be to live in the shadow of somebody like Ulysses S. Grant. There's going to be challenges along the way that come with being the child, and sometimes you're not even yourself. You're always, well, you're Grant's son, you're Grant's daughter, and you don't always have your own personal identity. But I think the way the kids turned out sort of probably exempts Grant from being too lenient or what have you, because each child, Fred, Ulysses Jr., Nellie, and Jesse, each one of them thought that they were the favorite child of their parents. So you must be doing something right if each child thinks that they're the favorite. So I think Grant did whatever he could to make sure his children would be happy and to provide for them. And, they're not perfect. Jesse Grant, the youngest son, tried to run for president in 1908, and probably you can kind of tell in these quotes here, Jesse kind of liked to do his own thing and probably had a degree of privilege that maybe he didn't always recognize. Nellie Grant got married at 18, and her first marriage was a very difficult one. But on the balance, I think overall, Grant passes the test as a wonderful father.
I would agree to that. When I read, it was when Jesse writes about the fact that he and his siblings all discovered as adults that they each felt they were the favored child. I think a parent who can make all of their children feel special, and especially because, again, this is a 19th century thing, that fathers were not supposed to be affectionate to their children because it made them weak, both the boys and the girls. I mean, there's and of course from the outside, and I think of all the sort of difficult, irritating people outside of the family, but who were surrounding U.S. Grant all the time. I mean, Jesse has some very strong opinions about Senator Charles Sumner, who Grant entertained like a friend in their house and then was his vicious enemy outside. So I'm sure he would have thought Grant was horribly indulgent. And I would imagine Queen Victoria felt that Jesse was a spoiled child because of his shenanigans, which he relates in great detail in his book at Windsor Castle. So, and I do think Jesse of the 4 children was the spoiled one. But then again, he's the baby when he spends his whole life growing up in the White House. It is home to him more than any other place in the world was. So, and I think that just really falls into the contemporary notion that each of us reflects our birth order, where we are in our family, and that my brother, who's 7 years my senior, and I, we both adored our father, but we knew him in very different ways because of that age gap. And that's really the way it works in any household. But, you know, Fred, my great grandfather, is the dutiful son because he follows him to West Point, and I sort of suspect he didn't have a lot of choice. Maybe he did, maybe more choice than Jesse gave Ulysses, but maybe less choice. And my grandfather had no choice at all because that was the deathbed letter: send my baby to Yale, to West Point. And so so that line of duty runs through Fred's line, and I think Nellie was the precious daughter, just like Julia was. And Julia ran off and married this feckless military guy, and that turned out okay. And Nellie ran off and married this Brit, and it didn't turn out okay. So I think he was indulgent in a very modern way that must have felt more alien. I think, again, that family feels very modern to me compared to what you hear about other families in that same period in the United States.
I could relate this, as you've asked, in what way did he command their respect and admiration, and how did this feed into him being able to discipline them? There's a number of articles in which the kids have told, you know, they've given interviews and said just how it was that Grant accomplished this. It's very interesting. This is what Fred had to say. His method was quite simple. He first created in the small child a feeling of absolute respect for him and belief in him. From that point, he ruled by kindness. I can recall but 2 or 3 occasions when he was compelled to be severe in his punishments. Generally speaking, he simply expressed his disapproval of an action, and that disapproval was always done in a very kindly way, and it was the severest punishment he could ever have inflicted on any of us. And you know, he had managed to internalize his own his belief in their worthiness into them, and it just seemed to work like a charm. And he did scold Jesse rather sternly, and I don't know if it was in that book that Dietz just finished reading or not, but yeah, he got into a bit of a squabble with Jesse at a dinner party because Jesse wouldn't behave, and it wasn't the one in England. It was one.
Oh yeah, no, that you're quite right. Is right. He was really.
He threw his hat on the floor, and then Grant said, Grant told Jesse to sit down, so he sat down, and he said, "Now Jesse, take off your hat." And so Jesse took off his hat and threw it on the floor. And Grant said, "Now Jesse, pick up your hat." And by that time, Jesse had it, and he started to cry or something, and Grant comforted him and, you know, smoothed things over. It was all real sweet.
Those are good stories. They are illustrative, you know. I mean, those are definitely illustrative of the way that he managed, you know, the children and how he commanded the respect of the children without necessarily having to be a heavy disciplinarian.
Right. Yeah.
You know, and again, that speaks to Ulysses. You know, I don't want to use the term, but modern age parenting. You know, go to the corner instead of the leather belt. You know, it's a more modern way of time
out.
yeah, timeouts. So it does seem, you know, I see what you're saying there. I mean, it does seem like their affection, their open affection, things like that. You know, Ulysses and Julia, we're going back a little bit, but we're, you know, talking about how they acted like, you know, people, more than one person explained that they acted like, you know, young lovers, even into their midlife, and, you know, that they'd show affection, you know, maybe a little bit more modestly than they used to, but still beyond what was normally acceptable at that time. So certainly they decided they wanted to live their own life the way they were going to live it. And they certainly lived it despite the social norms of the time. I don't think they were that much of an outlier, but I definitely, as Ulysses mentioned, something that sparked a little bit of a side eye from some of the people of that era. So let's see, we kind of did that question a little bit already. What, you know, I think one of the biggest things that I come back to, and it seems like a strange question, but what are the separations that Grant has? There seems to be this very it's emphasized a lot in especially in the books I've read on Grant, that he was just, he could not stand, like mentally stand being away from his family. Just having them physically there, was just so important to him. And would you agree that the evidence points to that? I mean, you're looking at 4 years away from Julia in the Mexican War, 2 years on the West Coast, away from his young son and his newborn he never met, and then later on in the Civil War, times that he's separated, and of course, even in the adult life, trying to spend as much time as he can with his family that started to scatter themselves. So would you agree that Grant, what can we learn from Grant's behavior and his mental state when he's separated from his family in regards to his relationship with his family?
I think for Grant, I mean, on the one hand, yeah, I think it was a great struggle for him to be away from his family. But my response would also be, who wouldn't struggle under those circumstances, especially the kind of person we've described here as somebody who is devoted to his wife and very loving and caring and very intimate in terms of the relationship with his children. I think with Grant, you have, on the one hand, you've got to make a choice between your job and your family, and I think a lot of people could sort of sympathize with, sometimes you're in a situation where you're trying to provide for your family, but that also requires you to be away from your family. And then likewise, Grant has a very difficult decision to make between service to his country and being there for his family. Anybody in the military, when you join the military, you're signing up for a larger ideal than just being there for your family. You have to be at your beck and call of your nation. So I think really in the grand scheme of things, I think Grant did about as good as anybody could have done in dealing with the stresses and the challenges of being away from his family, and in many cases having to wait for months for one letter to get to him out in the West. And so I'll go back to what I mentioned earlier. If you go through Grant's letters in volume 1 of his papers in the 1850s, every letter he's asking about what the children are doing. He's asking Julia to give, a hug and a kiss to the kids. Tell them that, I'm thinking of them. And it's little things like that to me just really show how much Grant cared about his family. And making this difficult decision to be in the military and being away from his family, but still having them always on his mind. He did the best that he could given the circumstances.
I think as long as he had something to do, he could squeak by. But when there wasn't anything much to do, like there wasn't at Fort Humboldt, that's when he really slipped into a real case of depression. That's my take.
And it's hard, again, I think, for anybody today to grasp. I mean, Fort Humboldt is up near Eureka.
Right.
And I've never even made it that far up in California. I set out one day from San Francisco thinking, oh, I'll drive up to Eureka. And I realized, oh, it's way up there. And back then there's no communication. There's no trains. There's no, I mean, this is isolation, like even with other soldiers around him. I just can't even imagine. I think it would all be so much easier today. I mean, he'd be really good at FaceTime and whatever, Zoom. What can I say? Can you imagine Grant family Zooms? But I think, and it's funny because he seems not to have been so troubled before he was married. When he was in the Mexican War, he was troubled by Julia's lack of letter writing, patience or duty or something. But he, he hadn't married her yet. He hadn't lived with her yet. And I think that was a huge change for him once he became part of something more than himself. I think that bonding with another person, which was different from his relationship to his parents by a long shot, I think that just changed him. And I've always seen that ultimate break with the military in 1854, it was. The first break is because this new person he became in 1848 is not the person that was in Mexico in the early 1840s and just couldn't handle that isolation. And there was no remedy for it. That's the thing, is there really was no remedy for it, because there weren't even trains to get the mail across the country in anything under months and months and months. So it was worse than being in Europe, because the transport back and forth between the US and Europe to the East Coast was regular, and to the West Coast was random. So it's no surprise that he couldn't deal with that isolation.
Wonderful responses. I think that yeah, the isolation, you just can't imagine it. I remember one story where he gets a letter from Julia, and it's got the traced hand of his son that was born after he left, Ulysses Jr., and he just broke down. He broke down uncharacteristically, apparently. So I'm going to combine some of the questions and kind of throw it at the wall here, since we're running shorter on time. Basically, there's a lot of people that were in around the Grants a lot. Numerous people, almost every source I look into, except for the critical one that I was using earlier, say that the Grants had an incredibly tight-knit family. They had a healthy, family unit. And I'm thinking, are they hiding it? I mean, could it be hiding dysfunction? And I just can't find it anywhere. It seems like they genuinely had really good, they were really supportive of each other. They had really good communication with each other. They stayed in touch. They kept in close contact through letters, even when they moved away as adults. They had Long Branch, which was the New Jersey seashore cottage, where even Nellie would come back with her children from England to be with the family. And of course, Grant was, broken up entirely emotionally when Nellie left at 18 years old. As Nick mentioned, she left at a young age, and he didn't want to see his daughter go off. He knew at that moment that he was going to have very little interaction with her after she left. They kept up a strong correspondence afterwards, but certainly that wasn't the same thing. So we have people like George Childs, the publisher that became one of Grant's best friends, that never gets mentioned ever in biographies much, but he's a big part of Grant's life. He says, General Grant seemed happiness in his home circle, surrounded by his devoted and loving wife and his children and grandchildren. I have never seen an instance of greater domestic happiness than that which existed in the Grant family. For his family, he had the most supreme love and tenderness. But this is echoed by multiple sources that say this. And I don't think they're just doing lip service. So does anybody believe that's not the case, for one? And two, does anybody know what the secrets are that you've seen in your research being such a tight-knit family?
Well, if we knew those secrets. Something popped into my head earlier, though, is in the way they discipline the children without disciplining them, is that I do think there's something, and I don't know where this comes from, but there is something in Grant which in politics becomes a bit of an Achilles heel, just to keep that classical motif going, is that and maybe this comes from his mother, is that he sees everybody as essentially good. That he sees the goodness in every person and acts on that basis. And of course, in politics, that gets him into hot water again and again, both with his own party and with his opposing party, with his enemies and even with his friends, because he's betrayed repeatedly. And it's not because he's stupid, but because he can't believe they're not good. And that inability to accept badness. I mean, Jesse even writes about that in his memoirs, but I think that's it. I think that's the way he saw his children. And if you see your children, I mean, there's the modern joke of the parent who allows their children to run around screaming and disturbing people because they're expressing their inner creativity. That's taking it too far. But the idea of seeing your children and your wife as essentially good people who are worthy, who you want to be worthy of, and vice versa, I think that creates a dynamic for happiness, as opposed to, the controlling thing. I was thinking even Fred Dent, not really giving anything, but holding the strings to keep that. So that's why Grant and even Julia had issues with their fathers, but the grandchildren didn't so much because those strings were gone. And but I think there's an essential belief there's a very strong belief in the 19th century that children are either innocent little formless angels or they're little evil people that need to be controlled. I mean, those are the kind of two wings of it. And I think Ulysses and Julia didn't go to either extreme. I think they saw their children the way they saw each other, as blessings that needed to be nurtured. And I think that's too simplistic because life is not that simple. But it seems to be. I'll tell you, just from my historical distant vantage point, I see them as I see their life story as one of the great romantic epics of the 19th century. And I've said this before, and I hope to God, whoever owns the rights to the big book on Grant makes something more out of it than a History Channel movie. Because there's a romance in there that's that could rival any romantic cinema. And it could be done really well. So that's just me spouting.
Yeah, no, I thought it's very thoughtful, and it's very difficult to get parenting down to a science. Life is just to quote Grant himself, man proposes and God disposes, right? So, but I would say that effective parenting is reinforced through both words and actions. It's what you say, it's how you vocalize your emotions and feelings to your children, how you communicate with your children, but then it's also through your actions and leading by example and demonstrating what it means to be a good person, what it means to live a happy, meaningful life. And so I think Ulysses and Julia tried their best to back up, good parenting through both words and actions to sort of set the table to ensure that their 4 children had a good, meaningful life. And I also think it's supporting the children through thick and thin. We're doing this presentation on July 11th, 2021, and on July 11th, 1875, Nellie Grant gave birth to the Grant's first grandchild, Grant Sartoris. And Grant Sartoris died only a few months later in May of 1876. No doubt a very, very painful episode. The first grandchild, the first child of Nellie and Algernon Sartoris. And it's moments like that where your words and actions are just as important as during the happy times too.
Yeah, that's certainly something to consider, is how families dealt with, again, we know about infant mortality in that era, but just how they responded. And I guarantee, just from what I've seen in other instances, that, they certainly were a pillar of support for each other at that moment. I think that brings us to kind of towards the end here, is that Grant, obviously, his final act, that's the way to call it. It's almost like it's a saga. It's a dramatic act, was to, devote the last year of his life, which was full of tragedy and full of, illness and suffering, but to still rise above it and devote that time to completing a task that would, that would leave his family with a financial legacy. And I think that act of devotion is where it's almost the bookend to, the rest of his life, where he elevated his family to a point where, as has been mentioned, not every 19th century, father figure did. Some, kind of parented, hands-off parenting, weren't as affectionate. And it seems like Grant really showed that incredible devotion, but also his family came together and were, I think of Nellie coming across the ocean, think of, all these things. They really show how much the family reciprocated his affection, his love. It seemed to be a very healthy environment. I'll read one quote that I think is very, Nellie did not write much. She didn't leave much to posterity. Fred left some articles. You can find these on the Ulysses S. Grant Information Center page. You can find a lot of this information, but that's a little bit more obscure. And we can thank Marie for finding a lot of this stuff, buried in the nether regions of the internet and all other places. But it really shows, I think it encapsulates all of what we've been talking about. It says, this is Nellie Grant, his daughter. He says, I think my father believed the greatest tribute a man could receive was the thorough love and trust of his family. And I think that really, I think she's saying that because, that was what she experienced. That was what Grant put above everything else. He had his country up here, they do the God, country, guns, whatever it is, but Grant had his family was a priority in his life, a high priority, if not the top priority, especially at the end. But his country was there too. He had to serve his country, but it was always about duty. And I want to try to bring it full circle. And one thing specifically for Ulysses, is there anything left in the way of traditions within the descendants that you interact with, that you feel has trickled down from through the generations? I mean, it could be genetically, I guess, but also traditions.
Well, there's a lot of mixture that's gone in. At my level, we're all the great grandchildren are third cousins, and at 66, I'm the youngest of that entire generation. And I have to write an essay about the family for the book that the U.S. Grant Association is going to bring out next year. And every once in a while, I remember that I have to do that because I've been thinking a lot about it. But I think each family line has held on to its own perspective. And I think that reflects the child they're descended from. And next week, I am going to California for the funeral of one of the great-great-grandchildren, my cousin Miriam Selgren, who I was very fond of, but who was 20 years my senior. And but when I visited her in San Diego last time, so she's one of Buck's descendants, she showed me photo albums that had been taken at Buck and Fanny Grant's estate in upstate New York called Merriweather Farm. And it's the only pictures I have ever had, other than the one behind you, Ben, of my grandfather as a child, and not as a little child, that famous image of him as a little boy in ringlets, but as a 6-year-old playing with his cousins. And they're all playing. They're photographs of these children playing together. The two Julias, because there's Julia, Buck's Julia and Fred's Julia, and then Ulysses, and they're goofing around. And it's the most extraordinary thing because you don't see pictures like this from the 19th century very often. But I get a sense that tradition is very strong in Buck's family. And Buck's second marriage after Fanny died may have been happy for him, but not happy for his children. And my mother met America Grant, Buck's second wife. And Fred and Ida were devoted until the end of their lives. And my mother never knew Fred, but she knew Ida very well. And I think each line of children passes that through. I know the Sartorises, which is, I always pronounce Sartoris because they're French, and that's the way they say it. But I met them at Whitehaven the first time, 20 some years ago. And they all have a very strong memory of Nellie, but Nellie is the one they really think about, and her history, and her ne'er-do-well husband Algernon started something that would be repeated in that family, as I've been told by the descendants. And there's a lot of them. That's a very big family. And so I think each of us in my generation has a slightly different vision of who the family is. And I think it comes together, I think, as we all share anybody who knows anything. And I didn't know anything. And I remember by the way, it was Marie Kelsey who came up to me at a U.S. Grant meeting once and asked me, what was the last book on U.S. Grant you read? And I looked at you because I had never read a book on U.S. Grant. And I thought, oh dear, this is a real problem, isn't it? So, and that's a long time ago when we first met. And, but I think it depends on how much they know beyond the child they're descended from. They all seem to know that child, all those lines. And how they feel about Ulysses and Julia depends on who their child was, if you see what I mean. So I think I wish we would get together more, and I'm going to talk to as many people as I can tactfully at a funeral next week. So we'll see, because that might not be the best place to be yakking about family, but maybe it'll be the perfect place.
You had just to bring it up, you had a program, I've watched it online. It was at the Mississippi State University Grant Presidential Library. I believe it may have been a U.S. Grant Association meeting.
Yes, it was one of our annual meetings.
Growing Up Grant program, and you had multiple descendants with you at that presentation. That's available online. I'll put the link in the comments here, and we'll share that, because that's again wonderful to hear that. The take of actual descendants of the general. I think that's I appreciate you bringing that to the discussion today, for sure. It brings a very unique perspective, and I appreciate that so much. So any final thoughts on Grant the Family Man from our panel? Any final thoughts? Don't all go at once. We have
any questions on Facebook, Ben?
Yeah. So, oh, that's a good question. I just got one, just came in. Mr. Dietz, have you read your grandfather's book? That must be the biography that Ulysses Grant III wrote, I think it was in the 60s, towards the end of his life.
Yeah, who actually, my grandfather finished that book right before he died, just like his grandfather. And, I carried a copy of it around with me for years and years and years, and I never read it. And now I don't know where it is. So I really do have to read that, because, until McFeely's book came out in 81, and then you have, now I'm blanking out, Bruce Catton's sort of series in the 50s. But really, there was no adequate biography, no adequate anything really written about U.S. Grant, although Marie would know the whole bibliography, until the 80s. And it's so, and of course I grew up with my grandfather's book, and it's called U.S. Grant Warrior and Statesman, I think.
Yeah.
And I expected that, like all the other books, it would be all about, my grandfather was a general, so it would be all about war and politics, which is, I started by reading Julia's Memoirs, which I've read 3 times now. And I actually keep it on my Kindle so I can word search it I just gave a lecture about Julia's jewelry, which was a pretty slim pickings, I'll tell you, but I went through her memoirs word by word to see if I could find references to jewelry. So now I've totally forgotten what your question was, but anyway, maybe I'll just stop.
Well, no, they just asked if you had read
my
the book.
grandfather's book, but
Yeah.
I'm going to keep looking for it, and maybe I'll just buy it online, because I really owe it to him to read it.
And I have myself, and the book is here. Yeah, like you said, it's called Warrior and Statesman, and it really is a pretty basic overview. There's not a lot of what you'd expect. Maybe some inner family stuff. There's not too much of that. He was basically, he says it right in the forward, he's just trying to set the record straight, because there's so much disinformation out there, especially going into the centennial, which he was a part of, the centennial of the Civil War, that he was really just trying to set the record straight. So it's just like his grandfather said, he wants to see history, and history written accurately. And I think that's what he was trying to do. So it doesn't really have a lot of, really deep personal insights. I mean, he was, 3 years old when his grandfather passed away. So he's really just trying to set the record straight. So it's a well-written, seems historically accurate for the time it was written. But yeah, you do have a duty to read it.
I promise I will read it.
If you need a copy, I'll send you one. And a lot of these things are available for free. Some of them I'll just mention. Archive.org is a great resource. As I mentioned, Marie's website, Ulysses S. Grant Information Center. That's a great website as well for finding some of these resources. And of course, Marie has a big bibliography out there. You can get it somewhere, I believe Amazon. It's an exhaustive, resource. It's wonderful. So we have an odd question. It seems to ring some sort of a bell. Did Julia name her bedpost after Grant after they first met? It sounds so familiar, but I don't know why.
She's nodding.
That's true. That's true.
Is that what? Just so she didn't get lonely? Is that? I don't want to get into it too far in case it's something terrible. But is it just?
So she just had something to talk to and pretend it was her man.
Yeah, nothing. I knew there's a little bit of superstition in the family. That I don't think that had anything to do with it. Maybe, I don't know. Magic bedpost. I don't know. All these things, there was a lot of spiritualism back then. There was a lot of things flowing around, and I know Julius had dreams, about I don't know what do they call it?
Presentiments.
Yeah, presentiment.
Or premonitions too.
Yeah, premonitions. There we are. And they seem to come true.
And her mother did too, didn't?
Yeah,
Ellen,
her mother said that Grant
did.
would be president someday, or I mean, these are things after the fact, but we'll take them with a grain. They're a good story, and Mark Twain says, "Don't let the truth get in the way of a good story." So we'll go with that. So there's one person requested that we put up a bibliography of some of the books mentioned. We will do that. We'll put that in the comments. One question is, do you think that Grant's experience of separation from his own family and the problems he had with getting messages through was a motivator to having him push for a better mail service during the Civil War? I've never.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, you think of those young men. He knew what it was like to be young. Yeah, so I think I'd have to agree with that. I mean, he would have known that these young men were. He was certainly acknowledged that the young men were homesick, and I think more than anything, he wanted to end the war for everybody's sake. I think that was the point. I think he'd rather end the war than mail. But yeah, there was huge advancements in telegraph service and mail service during the war. Although the scope of mail meant that there's no, it was not something that could be dealt with easily. I don't think. So I think we've somehow hit right on the dot. It has been a wonderful conversation. I wish it could go on all evening, maybe some cocktails and whatnot, but we have to draw it to a close. I can't thank our panelists enough for the research they've put in over the years, the interest they've taken in the life of Ulysses S. Grant, and of course, the information they've shared with many, many people over the years in all the efforts they've put in preserving and promoting the life of a great American and his family as well. It's important to remember, as we are trying to do at historic sites more and more, that they're more than just the individual that is most famous. There are others in the household. There are other people that deserve to be remembered and their stories to be told. So hopefully, by shedding a light on Grant's family life, we are also shedding a light on Grant's family themselves and how they played such a great role in supporting a man so that he could do so much for our nation. I believe, as our panelists may agree with, Grant would have had a hard time achieving what he did if he didn't have the support of his family, bolstering him mentally and being there at his most darkest times. And, it's mentioned multiple times that Grant had a different demeanor, essentially was almost a different person when family was around, a much brighter, a much more positive, optimistic person. And he was suffered severe bouts of depression and despondency when they were away. So he was, better, I think, hopelessly attached to his family. And I think that's the biggest part of it, in him achieving the things that he achieved. And I think that's part of the legacy. So they are part of his legacy. They're not, they're not to be taken on their own. And I think that's what we've gotten around to realize this evening, is how much of a role they played in reciprocating the love and the support to be able to do what he did for his nation. So I hope everyone's enjoyed. Does anybody have any final thoughts? Don't want to step on anybody's toes here. I've already gotten so much out of you, and I appreciate it. And it's been a wonderful evening. And so thank you, Marie. Thank you, Ulysses. Thank you, Nick. This has been a wonderful experience. Hope to collaborate again in the future. And certainly check out the website for Ulysses S. Grant National Historic Site in St. Louis. There's some wonderful content there, videos, historical content. Check that out. Visit if you get in the St. Louis area. Ulysses has a couple of books that were mentioned earlier in the program. We'll put them up as well in the comments later. And so definitely look into those excellent books. And grantcottage.org. Visit us at our website, and we have programming like this, and we appreciate your support of our programming. If you'd like to look into getting a membership or becoming involved with the Friends of Grant Cottage that run Grant Cottage Historic Site, you can do that at grantcottage.org. So I hope everyone has enjoyed tonight's program, has gained some insights. And again, thanks again to the panelists and all the support from our members. And we hope you get a chance to visit the historic sites that are represented today and learn even more about this amazing American hero and his family. And so thank you all, and have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.